Thank you. My appreciation and thanks to Jennifer and the AIIS for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here giving the talk on Muslim terrorism. Just two caveats. One, that if I start coughing, it's a very terrible cough and haven't recovered for a while. And the other one is that I have slightly changed the title of the topic, the title of my paper, and it is because this paper is a work in progress paper. I delivered it when I was invited to deliver a paper on Muslim terrorism at University of South Australia 2 years ago, and then subsequently at the Defence Force in Canberra, and then I was involved in other work and also engaged in publishing my book. So this was sitting on the shelf for a while, and then recently a colleague of mine from America asked me to publish a chapter in an edited volume. So this is I've started working on it again. Let's, if I could cover my paper, those are the areas I wish to cover. And given the time, let's see how much I get through. And probably I have to rush through towards the end. Anyway, the title of my paper is a sociological analysis of Muslim terrorism. Terrorism is a dark side of human behavior as featured throughout human history, and contrary to popular belief, is not a new phenomenon or unique to Muslims. It poses an increasingly precarious and challenging threat to the modern world. In the past number of decades, terrorist groups have gradually become seriously perilous in the light of openly available new and harmful weapons. Recent years have seen a change in identity of terrorists, their organizational structures, and their purposes. Before September 11th, a vast majority of acts of terrorism were readily foreseen, because they're dependent on predictable patterns of action. Recently, however, acts of terrorism have revealed that terrorists have been engaged in destructions and attempting to achieve effects far worse than before through mass attacks. The modern buildings and technological infrastructure are vulnerable targets for terrorists who have easy access to sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. Modern societies have certain vulnerabilities that terrorist groups or criminal gangs can without difficulty exploit. In many cases, it is evident that a small number of determined, educated, and well-to-do individuals can engage in acts of terrorism with far-reaching consequences and socio-economic costs. On 11 September 2001, USA and many Western countries were put on the notice by terrorists about the far-reaching consequences of terrorism never experienced before, while numerous countries in other parts of the world at the same time were trying to address the challenges terrorism posed to their societies for some time. For instance, countries such as England, Italy, Spain, and Mexico had been trying to rise to the challenge posed by terrorism for many years. Terrorism means different things to different people and is a very complex set of phenomena covering a large diversity of groups with dissimilar origins, causes, and methods. Many analyses of terrorism, as well as their recommendation for combating it, stress the significance of ideological, social, economic, and political determinants. Unfortunately, these factors often get ignored in policy consideration, and instead security factors are taken into account as most vital. Researchers have found over 200 definitions of terrorism, but cannot agree on universal definition, and one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. have become a real catchphrase. This poses a major problem in studying terrorism and developing policies to combat terrorism in the society. Despite definitional conundrum and disengagement, there is a general consensus among researchers and states regarding the core meaning of terrorism. Most agree that terrorism is undeniably an act of violence which undermines the stability of society and creates anxiety, apprehension, and even terror in people. In the last 10 years or so, declared as the age of war on terror, terrorism has come to be seen as a Muslim phenomenon and attributed to Islam through the invocation of the concept of jihad, holy war, which actually in fact in Arabic means struggle. This has been the case largely due to the role media has played, but also the role played by intellectuals and academics through the erroneous articulation of terrorism and linking terrorism to Muslims and to their faith. Today, therefore, in popular discourses and to some extent in intellectual exchanges, Muslims are stereotypically conceptualized as terrorists, and Islam is the abode of terrorism. This paper seeks to provide a modest contribution to the understanding of Muslim terrorism and explores terrorism not as a religious but a sociological phenomenon. It locates terrorism in the crisis situation of modern world or modernity and seeks to demonstrate terrorism as a religious response to colonialism, economic deprivation, social inequality, and political crisis in society. It sheds light on the fact that many terrorists are not just passive objects of social, economic, and political forces or puppets following the dictates of these causes, but are educated and innovative international actors who have developed well-worked-out methodology to execute their plan and to achieve their political goals. They negotiate the complex of choices dictated by the realities of the environment in which they or their supporters live. Using Bourdieu's theory of practice with a particular focus on the concept of habitus, the paper attempts to redefine the contours of terrorism by removing it from its surrogate abode in Islam to its rightful domicile in the post-colonial crisis situation of Muslim everyday living. The manner in which individuals conceptualize and utilize their capital, that is, resources procured through competition in the market economy, is the result of their habitus, which, I quote, is part of their personhood that filters their preconceptions, molds their tastes, and casts their inclination and dispositions, end of quote. Habitus may be discerned as structuring structure, the prism through which the political action and prism through which an individual appreciates the world and operates within it. Habitus, therefore, structures the political action and facilitates the individual to engage in the field. It stimulates the social resolutely at the heart of the human identity. The paper argues that Muslim terrorism is a response to the consequences of colonialism and the crisis of modernity, economic deprivation, social inequality, racism, injustice, and political instability, and so forth and so on. The paper seeks to demonstrate that what we are dealing with today is general habitus of terrorism induced by the crisis situation in society, directly afflicting many Muslims. The roots of the habitus of terrorism are deeply embedded in the crisis situation of post-colonial modernity. I want to talk to you about the definition of terrorism now, because it is important, as we heard in the beginning, about the lack of consensus on what terrorism means. The term terrorism has its origins in the word terror. The term terror is a Latin origin meaning violent. It is perhaps for this reason that terror is often used interchangeably with the term terrorism is used interchangeably with the term terror, creating a definitional conundrum and obscuring the possibility of a more precise, tangible, and meaning explanatory definition of the term. Also, terrorism is a term which is politically and emotionally charged, and at the same time not immutable, or leading to the task of defining terrorism in any precise way enormously difficult. It ought to be remembered that the definition of terrorism is imperative simply because it has important ramifications. For instance, organizing global counter-terrorism operations necessitates common agreement among those involved over rules and procedures. Prosecution, surveillance, pre-hearing incarcerations, and imprisonment under terrorism law similarly demands proper worked-out definition. Like the definition of terrorism, assigning the label of terrorist to an individual or an organization has real consequences. When a label of terrorist is assigned to the people or organization, they feel humiliated, and political parties and religious groups can suffer decline in membership and financial support as a consequence of such labeling. Just to give some ideas to what terrorism means, after 200 definitions, I don't think that it is necessary for me to add to that. But we need some kind of working definition to appreciate this phenomenon. So, in light of the fact that we don't have really consensus, we will try on Hoffman's definition model, which distinguishes certain pivotal characteristics of terrorism and leads to some understanding of the concept. In Hoffman's definition model, we are given to appreciate that terrorism is ineluctably politically aims and motives, violent or equally important threatens violence, designed to have far-reaching psychological repercussions beyond the immediate victim or target, conducted either by an organization with a chain of command or conspiratorial cell structure, or by individuals or small collection of individuals directly influenced, motivated, or inspired by the ideological aims or example of some existent terrorism movement and its leaders. It's important to remember about the origins of terrorism, and I'll just quickly say a few words about that in terms of where the terrorism as a phenomenon emerged. It is believed that terrorism as a practice originally started in 1st century Judea as a Jewish rebellion against Roman occupation. One faction of the rebels called Sicari. Sicari would use a short carved dagger called sika, from which they derived the name, to slit throats of Romans and members of the Jewish establishment openly in public. Sicari was skillful in guerrilla warfare and were renowned for the destruction of properties, and were part of a group known as zealots. Then you see during the French Revolution, the Jacobin Club, led by Maximilien Robespierre, which rose to power in France in 1792, and forcing what is called a reign of terror. This is a potent example of state terrorism executed to advance the objectives of a revolutionary movement. During the reign of terror, thousands of Jacobean opponents were arrested and tried in a revolutionary tribunal. Those found guilty were actually beheaded. Then in late 20th and early 21st centuries, some of the most extreme and vicious groups that involved in terrorism had an innovative religious ideology, for instance, Hamas, Hezbollah, and of course the most prominent, renowned one, Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. Some of these groups, including Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, espoused the method of suicide bombing, in which the bomber would try to cause destruction to an important economic, military, political, or iconic object by detonating a bomb strapped on the body. So we can see that terrorism has got a long history. That is an act of what we might call state terrorism, where someone is being beheaded. Okay, is it Louis XVI?
Yes.
Yeah. There you go. Not a very happy situation. Okay, it is important to talk about ideology upon which terrorists operate or act upon. Although there is no Islamic scriptural support for terrorism, the main ideology of Muslim terrorism is developed from a complex interpretation of the tenet of the word jihad, as I mentioned earlier, which is the foundation of Islam. Jihad advocates struggle against any evil. Now, I don't want to talk too much about jihad, but when we're talking about the concept of jihad, the holy war is the last level of jihad. There are 7 levels of jihad, or different forms of jihad. The first and the foremost is the jihad of the ego, and the last form of jihad is the holy war, and that needs to be actually justified to be acted upon. Transnational jihadists ideology asserts that Western states and societies are inimical to Islam. They see Islam and the Christian West in a conflictual relationship. Jihadists often trace this as far back as the Crusades. For example, Osama bin Laden almost necessarily portrayed his enemy as violent and his call for combat against them as defensive. Defensive jihad, therefore, is different from offensive jihad. Defensive jihad is fard al-ayn, which means that it is a personal duty of all Muslims to fight against evil. Fard al-kifaya, it is a social obligation which is not obligatory on all Muslims if someone or others are already engaged in eradicating evil. Now, evil is meant of things such as injustice, murder, ill treatment of people, and so forth and so on. What we might call social evil generally. Hence, framing the combat as a defensive reaction against evil makes those engaged in this process appear to be the victims rather than the aggressors. And consequently, they cause a religious tone towards which all good Muslims are persuasively ushered. Jihadists have an articulated ideology and definitive plan. They generally work on a keen sense of the need for change on the individual and social levels. The individual, they believe, needs to be properly socialized into non-Western and their version of Islamic worldview, and the community should be remolded to espouse and project the Islamic values in the political, economic, and social structures of society. Islam is used, and some might even say abused, to reinforce group norms and provide for institution of moral sanctions for individual behavior. It is used to provide universal goals and values, which in turn offers a sense of community, the ummah. This makes jihadism an attempt to re-establish an Islamic order, albeit the jihadist version of it. Muslims governed by the Shariah, Islamic Law, a society in which justice, moral purity, peace and prosperity prevail, can be achieved through an Islamic polity. So basically the idea or ideological foundation of jihadist or terrorist organizations or group is to establish the caliphate or Islamic state based on Sharia so that peace, harmony and prosperity can be brought about, but the way they go about is opposite to that. Founded upon this ideology, Muslim terrorism is political terrorism or political in nature. And if we place Muslim experience in the context of European colonialism, a much clearer picture emerges that explains some of the motives and rationales behind Muslim terrorism in recent years. Okay, before I go on to the motives, just quickly talk about the conceptual framework that I'm using, which is the habitus. Habitus denotes people's ability to presuppose the mindset and actions needed within specific social settings or fields to better understand Muslim terrorism. It is a habitus and its connection with the field and the capital pressured by the field that establishes what a person is capable of doing or achieving. It is a common set of learned and embodied temperaments and a knowledge of the world, built out of both objective structures and individual biography. Godot says that the habitus is the product of the work of inculcation and appropriation necessary in order for those products of collective history, the objective structure, that is, language, economy, etc., to succeed in reproducing themselves more or less completely in the forms of durable dispositions. The term habitus is linked to the words habit and habitual. It denotes an inclination towards a particular way of behaving, like a given or almost natural worldview that embodies us or what we are beholden to, ingrained in our bodies as well as our intellects, normally at the subconscious level. It locates us as social beings in a particular context to which acts as a reference point for us and against which we evaluate all life experiences. Habitus is a second nature. Habitus helps us understand that Muslim militants, who are the ones largely involved in terrorist activity, have entered a new national and global settings produced by modernization and development. In these new settings, they are not only learning new knowledge and acquiring through learning and socialization a new habitus, but also attempting to revive some of the initial habitus or keeping them alive as a distinct social group as they negotiate their way through time and space. In their new settings, which are enormously complex and constantly changing, these Muslim militants categorize others such as Sunni and Shia, Al-Qaeda and Muslim modernists, Islam and the West, in terms of their membership to either same social group, Al-Qaeda, or different social groups such as Saudi monarchy. Habitus can be seen making sense when the emergence of terrorist organizations and the practice of violence in terms of simultaneous self-destruction and the destruction of others, including the material environment, are explored in light of a religious response to the crisis of modernity. In other words, Muslims join terrorist organizations to become part of a solid group with distinct identity and undertake certain rituals, practices, and training within it to develop a habitus of self-destruction. What I'm trying to say is that terrorists don't wake up in the morning and say, okay, I'm going to blow that particular building, I'm going to kill these many people. The inhabitants, the ability to do that undergoes a long process, and then only they are able to actually act on that. Now, what motivates and what are the causes of Muslim terrorism? Muslim terrorism is an act of violence committed by Muslims to achieve different political ends. For example, Osama bin Laden's AIIA aspires to end American presence in the Middle East and in a variety of Arab states, overthrow what it calls the infidel regimes, such as the Saudi monarchy, and undermine American support for the Israeli state and the Israeli mistreatment of Palestinians. There's also an argument which purports that the terrorist attacks are in opposition to Western global imperialism and cultural different influences on Muslim societies. Muslim terrorist attacks are to put a stop to this, as well as to the processes of social westernization and secularization, which terrorist groups oppose, which are seen rather ironically by terrorist groups as Al-Qaeda, as deleterious to Islamic way of life. There is also a historical factor involved, as we have seen about the history of Western colonialism, as we will see, history of Western colonialism and imperialism, and splitting up the control of the Muslim world after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1924. Just want to quickly talk about colonial experience and a few other points. Muslim colonial experience. In order to better understand the emergence of Muslim terrorism and gain a clearer insight into the phenomenon itself, a brief look at the colonial experience of the people of the Dar al-Islam, the people of the Abode al-Islam in the last 150 years is essential. The encounter of the West with the people of Dar al-Islam, or people of the Islamic world, brought about the decline of the Muslim world and then the subsequent reaccession of Islamic fundamentalism. In the last 150 years or so, terrorist ideas and motivations have emerged and serve as essentially in direct response to the challenges and experiences generated by Western influence and intrusion, particularly European expansion on Muslim life. The European conquest of Muslim territories, which began in the 16th century, overwhelmed Muslim societies with new Western technologies, methods of economic management, political systems, and, of course, ideology. Muslim rulers who had reigned supreme for many centuries fell decisively under the Western domination by the 19th century, and the societies were confronted with a multiplicity of challenges. The advent of colonialism broke up the established political order, particularly that of the Mughal Islamic dynasties and the Safavid and the Ottoman empires, which remained intact for centuries and contested traditional beliefs and norms, thus causing major crisis of Islamic authority and Muslim identity. Under Western influence and colonial rule, modernity found its way into the Dar al-Islam, bringing sweeping changes in the Muslim world. The process of secularization, Arabization, modernization undermined and challenged older myths, doctrines, institutions, social structures, and social relationships. As a result, Muslims and Muslim societies underwent radical socio-economic, cultural, political reshuffles and changes. So, because of these changes, and of course, with the installation of regimes that supported Western ideologies and Western ideas, and not bringing about social, economic, and political progress in society, groups emerged as a response to that. There is also another factor that contributed to the emergence of Muslim terrorism, and just briefly, I want to talk about the economic and material deprivation. The impact of limited economic opportunities has a multiplier effect which links with the attraction to militancy and terrorism. In Muslim countries, a strong cultural expectations exist for young men. Employment for young men forms a conduit to independence, enabling them to purchase their own house, get married and raise children or families. With social breakdown and economic crisis, many young men and young men are the ones who are committing acts of terrorism. And even women are unable to achieve this, and therefore are forced into long-term or even permanent social cadetship. This experience is not unique to young men in the Muslim world, but young men in other poor countries suffer similar experiences. This transition into adult independence will seem unchangeable for many young people, and when they feel most vulnerable, the terrorist organizations appear offering solutions. The appeal to terrorism or terrorist organizations then is not only about economic independence or class position in the Marxist sense, but associated with status in variances connected to the importance of lifestyle, participation in consumer culture, and a sense of social freedom and well-being. Terrorism is definitely not a single phenomenon, but a heterogeneous reality. However, despite all the difference, there is something that brings different terrorists and terrorist groups together, and that is their dissatisfaction with the prevailing economic conditions, particularly poverty. Just a little bit more on the crisis of modernity, which is a catalyst to the emergence of Muslim terrorism. In this crisis of modernity perspective, the catalyst for Muslim terrorism are the negative consequences of the process of modernization. The modernization moral and the political elites linked to it have often unsuccessfully prevented the Muslim world's decline and stopped its political and economic dependency on the West. Hunter argues, and I quote, "Thus, while material modernity has tended to disintegrate all socio-political institutions and patterns of relationships, it has not replaced them with new ones. The result for the majority of people, psychological, social, and political alienation. These feelings propelled to seek some sense of stability and continuity by reverting to the traditional way of life." And another quote from Ayyubi, "When modernization stumbled, failing to achieve the promised economic development and instead deepened the alienation and dependency of society, groups that were previously excluded or promised what was never given came forward with the alternative additional system." So I just want to move on from that. Just to mention some of the consequences of terrorism, and then I'll conclude. The consequences of terrorism on society are always astronomical, impacting directly, especially on social and economic conditions of people. On the natural environment, terrorism causes land devastation, from where a lot of natural resources and farm produce are derived, and destruction of physical infrastructure, causing difficulties in labor movement and transportation of goods and services. The human cost of terrorism is obvious, that is the loss of lives, abductions of individuals, displacement of communities, and destruction of social networks and relationships. On capital, the consequences of terrorism accelerate and escalate international criminal finance, financial activities, and financial extortion from individuals, businesses, and large corporations. Other consequences of Muslim terrorism is the new terrorism laws in different countries, America, Australia, New Zealand, so forth and so on. New security policies and measures, new wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, rise of Islamism, rise in conversion to Islam, rise in Islamic studies, new centers, departments, universities, organizations, rise in Islamic research, for instance, Islamic revivalism, Shariah, so forth and so on, rise in refugees, interfaith dialogue, racism, etc. In conclusion, I want to say that Habitus denoting people's ability to presuppose the mindset and actions needed within specific social settings or fields to better understand Muslim terrorism. It helps us understand Muslim militants who are the ones largely involved in terrorist activities have entered a new national and global settings produced by modernization and development. In these new settings, they are not only learning new knowledge and acquiring through learning socialization new habitus, but also attempting to revive some of the initial habitus. Members of social group, in their view, that is the terrorist, in their view, new settings, which are enormously complex and constantly changing, these Muslims categorize others such as Sunni and Shia, Al-Qaeda and Muslim modernist Islam in the West in terms of their membership to either the same group, in-group that is Al-Qaeda such as, or different groups such as Saudi monarchy, the out-group. Members of a social group that is the in-group place greater emphasis on their socially shared standards, norms which distinguish them from out-groups, and they develop a unique habitus, and such as suicide bombers from Hezbollah movement. Social groups such as Al-Qaeda have their own rituals, practices and ideology. Members need to learn them and practice them. Practices such as combat training, suicide bombing practices to act normal and bomb strapped on their bodies, etc. After some time, all these rituals and practices become a norm, part of everyday life. Not blowing yourself, but practicing to blow. Doing all these separates the members from others and other groups. They have their own categories, assumptions, and criteria to use to make sense of their own activities and the world as well, to use them to measure others. Once the rituals and practices become habitualized, they form the habitus, which is a second nature. Hence, to blow up one's body is no longer an issue, because blowing up the body has become an embodied ritual practice, which is the habitus. Body blowing up is no longer subject to rationalization. You don't have to think about it, because if you do think about it, the probability is you're not going to blow yourself up. But has become a spontaneous response to the crisis situation. Thank you very much. I'm not sure which movement you're referring to in terms of fringe movements, but Islamist movements often focus on the young people for a variety of reasons. In my own research in Islamic revivalism, a lot of Muslims who are young are returning to religion for a variety of reasons, and some of the reasons are which could be used for what we might call terrorist organizations or groups might use the same approach. In Muslim world or Muslim countries, and to some extent in non-Muslim countries, when people have nothing better to do because they are unemployed, they don't have access to education, and when members of movements such as Al-Qaeda or Al-Ikhwan al-Muslim or Muslim Brotherhood or Hizb ut-Tahrir approaches the young people to demonstrate to them that they can achieve bliss in this world as well as in the hereafter by engaging in religious activities, because of their what we might call young minds, and because of their disengagement in social, economic and political activities, well, largely because they have nothing else to do, often are attracted to these kind of propositions. And you'll find, for example, in Australia, there's a movement called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is constituted by largely young members of Muslim community, and they live at home, they go to university or might might have some part-time job, but if they are university students, for example, they won't be working because they're supported by the family, they're not married, they have got all the time in the world. And if a sheikh approaches them and provides them with some ideological explanation as to what's happening in the world, the crisis and so forth, they get attracted to it easily. This idea of brainwashing, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but sociologically it's kind of a problematic concept, but nevertheless, this idea of brainwashing seems to be occurring quite a lot with young people, and therefore they get attracted to it. I suppose the idea is that when you show someone who has got nothing, some kind of carrots, if you like, I suppose people, especially with young minds, get attracted to that. I was asked the same question earlier with the interns, and I've been asked this question in South Australia as well as in Canberra, and I think if I knew the answer, I wouldn't be standing here. I probably would be relaxing with, some $1 million resort or whatever. I suppose my response to that is that first and foremost, the Muslim terrorism as a phenomenon compared to terrorism in general is a small phenomenon. It's not as pervasive as I forgot the gentleman's name, Shannon was showing in the graph. But I think as a sociologist, the catalyst, the causation of contemporary Muslim terrorism is very much rooted in the socio-economic and political crisis of society. So, for example, Arab Spring is an interesting example. Why it's happening, what is happening in Syria at the moment, what happened in Egypt, what happened in Libya, is we are sociologically seeing a phenomenon which is a response to the crisis in these different societies. Muammar Gaddafi, for example, was an authoritarian dictatorship. Egyptian president did allow democracy to prevail, and what we're seeing in Syria at the moment is very similar to those things that happened in the other two countries. So I think if we look at the issues, the problems that exist in these countries, we will begin to understand that the society is in crisis and people are responding to that in different ways. And terrorism is one way, not the only way. On the other hand, you will see, for example, in my own empirical research on Islamic revivalism, that Muslims are responding to the crisis of modernity, such as injustice, atrocity, social inequality, whatever, through retaining to religion. Not that religion suddenly gives them equality, or not that suddenly religion gives them employment, but that they find solace, they find comfort, they find brotherhood, they find a more clarified identity in the religious group that they actually engage in. So similarly, they would find something similar in terrorist groups. You are our brother, we look after you, or you're our sisters, we look after you, we provide whatever we can provide for you and your family. So it's not only material provision, but it is also what we might call social and spiritual provisions that the movements, whether Islamic or terrorist groups, provide that attract people, especially young people.
Yes. Do you think it's possible to deal successfully with Muslim extremism successfully in a non-violent manner? For example, in Afghanistan, apparently there are some efforts through discussions, if you want to call it diplomacy or whatever, to convert them from their ways. What is your opinion of that approach?
If you look at the literature regarding the enculturation of different cultures, different community groups, it is not an easy process. As I, towards the end, quoted some of the scholars in this area, especially if it is not well worked out process or a methodology that is not thought out much. So for example, if Afghanistanis are to be somehow mobilized into espousing modern ways of living, including modern ways of managing their agriculture, their farming, their business, and so forth and so on. I think it's a good approach, but it needs to be a well worked out approach, well worked out a system in which these people can be engaged in. If it's forced upon them or if it's a quick process, it might have opposite reaction. And so history reveals in the Islamic or Muslim world that anything that is done in a rush way might have opposite reaction or opposite consequences. If you look at works done by John Esposito, the leading Islamic scholar, he argues in that similar way that modernization of society is not a bad thing, and Muslims are not necessarily against modernization, but the process needs to be well worked out so that it allows the people to become familiar with the process and become adaptable to that. I'm a sociologist, and so sociologists often try to explore and explain problems rather than provide solutions. But if I had the opportunity to speak to Julia Gillard and see if she could fork out $1 billion to resolve the world crisis, I suppose the Muslim extremism problem or radicalism is a small phenomenon compared to what I call in my book Islamic revivalism, which is a much bigger phenomenon. And it is achieving greater success than Islamist groups or militant groups. What that research demonstrates is that the people who return to religion are largely people who find themselves somewhat dissatisfied with the way the society operates, whether they are poor, such as unemployed people or poverty-stricken, or where they are wealthy. Because after all, we need to appreciate that both those who constitute the movements of Islamic revivalism and those who constitute the movements of Islamist movements, terrorist that is, are not necessarily all poor and poverty-stricken people. There are some rich, wealthy people who have had status in society as well. And why these both types of people are involved in these kinds of groups can be explained as I was trying to explain in terms of the perspective of crisis of modernity. And this is not only my perspective. You look at John Esposito's work, Harari's work, and others who have done some work, empirical work, tend to subscribe to this perspective. None that I know. Well, see, if you look at the just war theory, why people blow themselves up, especially in Palestine. Now, if you talk to the people who have suffered the atrocities that they have, then you begin to understand what's really going on. Now, you tell me, I have got 3 kids, I've got a wife, I've got an academic career, I've got a mortgage, I'm giving a paper here, I call myself reasonably decent and engaged in social development in society. Now, you tell me, oh, if you put yourself in a similar situation, if someone takes that all away from me, you reckon I'm going to praise the praise them and say good on you, or I will try to do something which, generally speaking, will be irrational, but for me it will be rational. So suicide bombing, for example, terrorism, same kind of thing, has got that kind of terrorist or people, those people have got that kind of position when you take everything from them, or when they have got nothing to actually aspire to, then this is one way out, not necessarily the way out, but one way out. There are both rich people and poor people in Muslim revivalist groups, as well as in Muslim terrorist organizations, and those who are well-to-do, educated people gain membership to the terrorist organizations because they sympathize with their brothers. So again, this idea of if a poor person is being hurt for whatever reason, if he or she is suffering from poverty, injustice, discrimination, whatever the cause or the reason may be, then they get into a dialogue with them and show their brotherhood or their sense of brotherhood that, okay, I'll try to see what I can do. So that's the kind of a reaction the rich people make towards this situation. It is not necessarily blaming colonization as such, but colonization not necessarily produced happiness in wherever colonialists went. It brought about sweeping changes, in many cases negative social, economic and political and cultural changes. And what we see, therefore, is a response to that, a response to the crisis brought about by the process of colonization. So, in that sense, the sociological analysis is that why people are doing what they're doing. We need to understand that. And of course, this is only one way of looking at it, not the way of looking at it. So the sociological perspective subscribes to this idea that when society is in crisis, which in this case would be brought about through colonization, then there will be a response, there will be a reaction to that. And there is a multiple reactions or variety of reactions, and terrorism or religious revivalism is just one reaction. In terms of Islam, Islam means submission, and Islam, according to the literature about the evolution and development of Islam, you will find, particularly Lapidus' work and others, you will find that Islam did expand quite quickly into other parts of the world, and largely it was a peaceful expansion. But having said that, the expansion undertaken by the people, particularly the leaders or the caliphs or the caliphs of Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid, Ottoman Empire, Mughal Empire, were largely leaders who actually went against the teaching of Islam. For example, there were subscribers of hereditary bloodline leadership and so forth and so on. So in that sense, it is the Muslims' misinterpretation of the teachings of Islam that has led to that outcome, not necessarily the scriptural dictates of the religion. And I'm sure that other religions would have the similar position. It's not the religion itself, but its interpretation, its understanding that leads people to believe and therefore act, which actually goes against the actual teaching of Islam or religion. So in conclusion, there are two kinds of Islam I talk about. One is what I call the theoretical Islam, and the other one is what I call existential Islam. And the issues you're raising are more associated with existential Islam than the theoretical Islam. And we can see that in other religions.